This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Talia.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Crimes and Consequences. I hope everybody had a great week. Did you?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Let's move on. I have a really interesting true crime story. It is gruesome, but compared to the ones we do, it doesn't seem so gruesome anymore.
Okay.
I mean, we've had some pretty rough ones.
We have had some rough ones recently.
This isn't on that level. With that, I'd like to ask everybody to hit the subscribe/follow button on whatever app you're listening to, and I'm going to start.
Awesome. Let's hear it.
It was a chilly June night as the young man crept through the woods of the Missouri River Headwaters State Park. He was so stealth that he didn't wake any of the campers sleeping in their tents and trailers that were scattered around the grounds. After all, he'd done this before, and he knew the area like the palm of his hand. As he crept among the tents and the smoldering cinders in the fire pits, he heard what sounded like two girls talking in one of the tents. This is what he'd been looking for, a child to snatch. That's my
Dun, dun, dun.
intro. It was the summer of 1973, and after the 5 Jaeger children's school ended for the year, the middle-class family of 7 set off in their van for a vacation of a lifetime.
God bless. Family of 7.
In a van, traveling across the United States. Although they'd never been camping before, they packed up supplies and headed to the big sky country of Montana. Bill Jaeger, the family's patriarch, he earned enough vacation time to get an entire month off work.
Nice.
Yeah, nice. Except you're in a van with your 5 kids.
Going camping.
But otherwise it's great. His wife, Marietta, was a full-time homemaker, and she planned most of the vacation out. The journey would take them 2,000 miles away from their Farmington Hills, Michigan home, all the way to the Rocky Mountains in Montana. After stopping in Mount Rushmore, the family made their way to the Missouri Headwaters State Park. Even though it's Missouri Headwaters State Park, it's actually in Three Forks, Montana. There they met up with Marietta's parents, Marie and William. We're going to call them the grandparents throughout the episode.
Okay.
The grandparents drove a truck, pulling their travel trailer all the way from Arizona up to the campgrounds to join the Jaegers. Nestled in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, the view was to die for. There were rolling, snow-peaked mountains to the east and west, and the canyons below were carved by the flowing rivers. Did you like that description?
I did. I can picture it in my head.
Perfect. The only hint of modern society was the occasional sound of a freight train passing by. The family set up camp around the Madison River. It was a circle formation made up of 3 vehicles that surrounded a 2-room tent they set up. There was a Jaeger van, which is where the oldest child, Dan, he was 17, that's where he slept. Bill and Marietta slept in the grandparents' truck, which had a camper cover on the back. The travel trailer completed the circle, and that's where the grandparents slept. The 4 youngest children, there's 16-year-old Frank, 13-year-old Heidi, 9-year-old Joey, and 7-year-old Susie, they all snuggled in their sleeping bags in the 2-room tent, with little Susie sandwiched between Heidi and Joey. The nearest campers to them were roughly 50 feet away. On June 25th, Marietta and Bill, along with their 3 sons and 2 daughters, they attended Mass at a Catholic church in Three Forks. Have you ever been to Montana?
I have not.
It's beautiful, but it's scarcely populated. And Three Forks is a very small community of 1,100 people. Later, they explored some caverns and caves. They intended to pull up camp the next morning and head out on a new adventure, but they hadn't decided where yet. When the sun went down, everyone prepared for bed. Bill and Marietta climbed inside the children's tent, and they gave them hugs and kisses goodnight. Confident their children were tucked away safely for the night, Marietta and Bill went into the truck camper, and they fell asleep. The children drifted to sleep, but Susie and Heidi both woke up around 1:30. I think Heidi had to use the bathroom and woke up her sister. And they ended up spending a few minutes talking. A few hours later, a breeze on the back of Heidi's head woke her up. She reached her arms behind her, and instead of hitting the tent wall, her hand touched the moist grass. Heidi sat up and immediately noticed a large hole in the tent in front of where Susie had been sleeping. And now, Susie was gone. In the still of the night, Bill and Marietta were awakened by 13-year-old Heidi frantically yelling that Susie was gone. Susie's gone. The couple grabbed some flashlights and they made their way through the darkness, expecting to find Susie probably buried somewhere in her sleeping bag. But when Bill shone the light in the tent, he was shocked to see this gaping hole near the bottom of it. On the grass outside the tent, they found the stuffed lamb Susie cuddled with at night. Hysterical, the family began yelling her name around the campground, stirring all the campers awake. People began looking and yelling out for Susie. Bill and Marietta drove to the marshal's office in Three Forks. As luck would have it, Marshal Tony Lutke, he was there, and he listened to the Jaegers. In his mind, he immediately got a flashback to a tragic murder 4 years earlier. There had been a Boy Scout outing in 1969, and the children had set up a tent in almost the exact location of the campgrounds as the Jaeger site. In the middle of the night, while the scouts and the leaders were sleeping, an intruder cut a hole in one of the tents and attempted to kidnap a 12-year-old boy named Michael Rainey. 3 faint screams of help awakened the scoutmaster. His name was Edgar Miller. Edgar checked all the different tents because there were multiple ones, but seeing nothing unusual, he went back to sleep. In the morning, Michael was found barely alive in a sleeping bag. He'd been forcefully hit on the head with some unknown blunt object and stabbed once in the back. For 2 days, Michael fought to survive, but his severe brain injury, it was too much for his body, and he died. 4 years later, Michael's killer remained unknown and at large. Marshal Lutke called the sheriff's department and the FBI for reinforcement. Technically, the FBI didn't have jurisdiction, but they still assisted in the investigation. Investigators interviewed all the campers nearby. There was this family of 7 in the site next to the Jaegers, and they slept outside in their sleeping bags, yet heard and saw nothing unusual. None of the dogs at the camp barked, and no one heard anything. A massive ground search was formed, and volunteers worked day and night, traversing the canyons. They dragged the rivers. They searched the mountains, looking for any sign of 7-year-old Susie. Multiple law enforcement agencies set up headquarters at the campgrounds next to the Jaegers campsite. But as the days dragged on, they were no closer to finding the little girl. On July 2nd, a week after the abduction, Sheriff Deputy Ronald Brown knocked on the Jaegers camper door with a chilling tale. A man claiming to be from Colorado called the deputy's wife at their home, telling her he had Susie, she was alive, and he would release her in exchange for $50,000. The money was to be placed in a locker at a bus station in Denver. The man told Mrs. Brown on the phone, and this is a quote, "In case you don't believe me, I can tell you the little girl has humpy fingernails," end quote. He was trying to convince her he really had Susie. Susie was born with a very minor birth defect that caused both of her index fingernails to be thicker and rounder than usual, instead of thin and flat. This information was known by only a few close friends and family, and now, obviously, by Susie's kidnapper. Before hanging up, the kidnapper told Mrs. Brown to expect another call with detailed instructions about the exchange. The ransom request gave the FBI official jurisdiction to investigate the case. Special Agent Pete Dunbar, he's from the Bozeman office, he was assigned lead on the case. The Jaegers didn't have $50,000 to drop off at a ransom site, but an anonymous donor put the funds in an account for them.
Well, that was nice.
Yeah. Weeks went by, and there was no follow-up call. One night, Marietta woke up from the most terrifying nightmare of her life. In her dream, she was an observer watching as Susie was strangled into unconsciousness and carried into the seat of a truck by a man. In the dream, Susie woke up disoriented and her neck hurt. She was taken to a building and forced to remove her clothes. Unthinkable things were done to her as she screamed in terror. And then, to silence Susie, the man strangled Susie, contorting her face. He then decapitated and dismembered her. She believed this dream was a vision of what most likely happened to Susie. 3 weeks after Susie's abduction, investigators left the campgrounds. They closed up that headquarters they'd established there, and they continued the investigation from the FBI's office in the neighboring town of Bozeman. The FBI polygraphed basically any man in Three Fork and nearby towns like Bozeman and Manhattan, because there was a Manhattan, Montana, that didn't have an alibi for the night. And all of them passed the tests. 4 weeks after Susie's abduction, the Jaegers were urged to return to the Detroit suburb home. Marietta and Bill wrote a letter to the kidnapper that was published nationally in all the papers. They urged the abductor to call them again, and they allowed the publication of their home phone number in the articles. So that way, they could have some sort of communication and hopefully find Susie. Bill and Marietta tried to maintain a normal life for the benefit of their other 4 children, but Marietta rarely left the home. Now, in 1973, there were no cell phones, there were no pagers, and there were no answering machines either.
That's why she stayed home.
Exactly. That's
she didn't
exactly
want
why.
to miss that call.
Someone needed to be near the family phone at all times. The family purchased a tape recorder, and no one was allowed to answer the phone without turning on the tape recorder first. They wanted to record the call for the FBI. Their vigilance paid off. While Marietta was picking up her 9-year-old son Joe from catechism class, the family phone rang. Her oldest son Dan turned on the tape recorder and he answered it. It was the kidnapper, authenticated by his comments once again about Susie's humpy fingernails. The man claimed Susie was still alive and he wanted to do the ransom exchange still, but he was hesitant about his ability to pull it off without getting caught. Smart.
Right.
I would be very concerned about that myself. Prior to ending the conversation, he promised to call again once he made a plan. Now, tracing calls in 1973 is nothing like tracing calls now. Back then, a place call would pass through relay stations sometimes in various states, making its origin almost impossible to determine. Not always, but sometimes. This particular phone call, the FBI, they were able to trace it. The kidnapper had placed the call from a payphone near a small diner in Wyoming. Through an operator, he charged the call to a different family with the last name Jaeger that lived in Wyoming. Back then, you could basically make a collect call and bill it to any third-party number you wanted.
Really?
I know, I did that once.
Of course you did, Talia.
Confession time, I did. I had a boy I liked out of town when I was 13. I just charged it to somebody. That call wouldn't be the last time the Jaeger family heard from the monster who took their daughter. Weeks turned into months with no new developments in the case. Then another tragedy struck the small town of Manhattan, Montana, which was only 12 miles away from where Susie was abducted. On February 9th, 8 months after Susie's kidnapping, 19-year-old Sandra Smallegan disappeared, along with her car, from her apartment after attending a local high school basketball game. Could there possibly be a link between the two girls' disappearance? Investigators didn't know. Special Agent Pete Dunbar decided to try a new approach to finding the perpetrator, as there were really no clues as to what happened to Sandra either. But his instinct told him the cases were linked. He reached out to FBI criminal psychologists in Quantico and sent them the case information for both Sandra and little Susie. Robert Ressler, Patrick Maloney, and Howard Tetton created the first psychological suspect profile ever used in an active FBI case for Agent Peter Dunbar.
Wow, it was the very first one?
Very first one. This is what they determined. The kidnapper who took Susie did it with the intent of keeping her for a time to cause her harm. That's all they say. I mean, we can use our imagination. He was a local white man in his mid-20s, unmarried, well-known, a loner with military experience, a hard worker with a job that didn't require interpersonal skills, and Susie wasn't his first victim.
I'm always amazed. Like, how do they know he's a hard worker?
I don't know, but they're pretty accurate. Well, in this one especially. They believe that he would have helped search for Susie.
Well, that's creepy.
So that way he didn't stand out with the locals. It's a small community. Everybody was searching, so he had to join in. Shockingly, the profile predicted that a search of the abductor's house would turn up hidden body parts.
Oh, no.
You will later see how eerily dead on the profilers were about this. 3 weeks after Sandra's disappearance, not Susie's, but 19-year-old Sandra's, her car was found in a barn on an abandoned ranch known as the Lockhart Ranch. A tarp, hay, and farming equipment were used in an attempt to conceal the vehicle. Inside the ranch house, there was an open closet door that appeared to have been repeatedly nailed shut, then opened, and then re-nailed shut again. Inside the closet were traces of blood, and also in the house was underwear, later identified as Sandra's. Outside the ranch house was a large oil drum containing a pile of ash. Sifting through the ash, investigators began to find bone fragments, the largest being only 2 inches in length. Eventually, over 1,200 pieces of bone and some teeth were unearthed at that ranch. Investigators said these bones had to have been pulverized or burned at an intensely high heat to reach the state they were in, to be basically just broken into pieces. Through dental records, and I'm not exactly sure how, but I think maybe through the teeth found, Sandra was identified as the victim. After the discovery of Sandra's bones, investigators were still no closer to finding her killer or finding Susie Jaeger. The 1-year anniversary of Susie's abduction was approaching, and Susie's parents decided to reach out to the media to draw attention to the case. Then, as they were sleeping on the 1-year anniversary, their phone rang. It was roughly 3 a.m. when Marietta answered the line and Bill turned on the tape recorder. It was a man on the phone, and he said, "Is this Susie's mom? I'm the guy who took her from you exactly a year ago to the minute today." Marietta politely asked if she could now have Susie back. But the man taunted her, saying, and this is a quote, "Well, I'm in a kind of awkward position to do that. Actually, I've gotten kind of used to having her around, and we've had quite the time together, traveling all over the West, visiting Disneyland and the San Diego Zoo. I've been working on her mind, almost got the memory of you, your home, and your other children wiped out of her mind through psychotherapy. It's kind of a long story, but I've always wanted my own little girl."
Oh my God.
Isn't that horrible?
What a bastard.
I know.
Can you imagine getting that phone call?
Such an asshole. Then the phone went dead. A minute later, there was a second call. It was the same man, and he apologized for the accidental hang-up. He continued to talk to Marietta for over an hour. In the interim, 17-year-old Dan ran to the neighbor's house to call the FBI while Bill and Marietta listened intently on the phone.
He talked to them for an hour?
Yes, partly because Marietta had been instructed to keep him on the phone as long as possible. So anytime the conversation started to fade off, she would rapid-fire questions to the man. The kidnapper explained that he had snuck up by the tent when Heidi and Susie were talking. He patiently waited for them to fall back asleep, and then he struck. He slit the hole in the tent, he choked Susie with his arm, and he dragged her away. He claimed that this was the only time he'd caused little Susie any harm.
Bullshit!
Yeah, bullshit. Time would reveal this was a far cry from the truth. In the background, the Jaegers could hear a train and also some crickets. In a desperate bid to keep the man on the phone, Marietta asked him, this is a quote, "How are you? You must be very burdened by what you've done," end quote. The man started weeping.
No.
Crying like a baby on the phone. He replied, quote, "I wish this terrible burden could be lifted. Goodbye," and hung up. The FBI traced the call to Sarasota, Florida. But weeks later, they would learn that the call had gone through a relay station there, and its original origins couldn't be determined.
Oh, that sucks. Especially having him on the phone for so long.
I know, it ended up being a dead end. But this is where it gets really interesting. A month later, Marietta was contacted by a telephone company in Montana, questioning a particular charge on one of their customers' bill.
Uh-oh.
A couple from the town of Three Forks owned a cabin with some farmland outside of town. Although they lived in the city, they would often go to this cabin and do farming. They noticed that the cabin address was charged for 2 long-distance calls made to Farmington Hills, Michigan on June 25th. Neither the woman nor her husband had placed those calls, and they didn't want to pay for them either.
I don't blame them.
The FBI immediately pursued this lead, and they went to the cabin and started examining the telephone poles. Tire tracks surrounded one particular pole, and closer examination showed the uninsulated wires had been clipped by someone who had the knowledge of how to tap phone lines. There was one young man in town that stood out in Agent Pete Dunbar's head that matched the profile and could tap a wire. But this man had passed a lie detector test early in the investigation and had been ruled out. 25-year-old David Meirhofer grew up near Three Forks and was considered a hardworking private man. He'd been on Agent Dunbar's radar, as I said before in the beginning, because he didn't have an alibi for the night of Susie's abductions. He lived at home alone. As a child, David was kicked out of the Boy Scouts for undisclosed concerning behaviors.
I would love to know what that is.
I know. In high school, he once attacked a boy with a knife. However, he went on to graduate and join the Marines, where he was trained to be a telephone technician. After completing his service, he returned to Three Forks, where his mother and younger brother still lived. Officers learned that he once asked Sandra Smallegan to go out with him, but she turned him down. David owned this warehouse where he did carpentry work, and it began to really look like he was their guy. But the FBI didn't have anything to arrest him for any crimes. There was no real evidence connecting him to anything. But they were convinced. They put surveillance on him. And Agent Dunbar confronted David with the allegations that he was a murderer. David denied any involvement and hired an attorney. His name was Douglas Dassinger, to represent him. Mr. Dassinger offered David's full cooperation in the investigation. Listen to this. Even agreeing for David to take a second lie detector test and be interviewed while under sodium amytal.
No.
Known as truth serum.
No, the attorney
Yeah,
agreed to
why
this?
not? Absolutely.
He's innocent.
He's absolutely
He must have been super
innocent.
convinced.
Oh, he was. One Friday, David arrived at the FBI headquarters in Bozeman, Montana, and he passed both the lie detector test and the truth serum interview. But later that night, a group of Girl Scouts, they began a weekend outing at the Silver Cloud Camp in Bozeman. They had multiple tents set up in which a number of girls slept in them. In the dark of night, after the girls had drifted asleep, a man untied one of the tents and crept inside. He tried to place a rope around one of the girls' necks and strangle her, but as he did it, she screamed. Other girls began screaming frantically, and someone turned on a flashlight, causing the man to run away.
Creeper, man.
Super creepy. I love camping true crime stories.
It just reminds me of a horror movie.
Exactly. This man was described as being in his mid-20s, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, slightly built, with light brown hair. And you know whose description he matched exactly?
David?
David. But none of the children were able to positively identify him. The FBI conducted what is called a voice lineup, and I had never heard of this. They had 4 different men, including David, because he agreed to, read a few lines from the transcript of the anniversary call to the Jaegers. These are then played for Bill and Marietta, and they immediately recognized David as the voice they'd heard on the phone. But that wasn't enough to arrest him. FBI profilers, in a desperate attempt to stop David, suggested that Marietta meet with him face to face to see if she could get an emotional reaction like she'd done before on the phone, and perhaps get him to confess. Surprisingly, David agreed to meet with Bill and Marietta, but the day prior to the Jaegers arriving in Montana, the police uncovered disturbing information that pointed to the brutal murder of little Susie. After they discovered Sandra Smallegan's bones on the Lockhart Ranch, investigators continued scouring the grounds, looking for more evidence. A team of officers decided to search an abandoned outhouse near the barn. They actually went inside the cesspit.
No.
And there they discovered what appeared to be the tailbone of a child. The bone was sent to the Smithsonian Institute for further evaluation, but the results were going to take a couple days. Meanwhile, Bill and Marietta arrived in Montana, and they went with Agent Dunbar to David's attorney's office. David showed up dressed in blue jeans and a Western-style shirt, and he sat in a chair less than 3 feet away from Marietta. Politely, he offered his condolences. He discussed how he'd been a part of the search efforts to find Susie. The attempt at a confession was a bust. He just denied any involvement in the crime. And it ate at Marietta. Later that night, when she and Bill returned to the motel room that they were staying in, she decided to call David at home. And he answered.
That's gutsy.
I know, because she fully believes he murdered her daughter. It takes a lot of courage. David had just returned from his weekly bowling league when his phone rang. Marietta pleaded with him to talk to her again, but he was really concerned that the phone call was being recorded. He agreed to meet with her in person the next morning at his warehouse on the condition she'd come there alone. Without informing the FBI, Bill dropped Marietta off at the warehouse and parked a distance away. This time, David's tone was different. He'd grown impatient with Marietta's insistence that he was responsible for Susie's abduction. Her pleading and begging him to admit to the crime annoyed him, and only ended up pushing him further away. This conversation ended up being completely fruitless. Frustrated and disappointed, the Jaegers flew back to Michigan, no closer to finding out what happened to their daughter than before they left. But that would soon all change. The Smithsonian Institute's analysis of the bone found in the outhouse pit determined it was a bone of a female between the ages of 6 and 8.
Oh.
There is no doubt in anyone's mind it was Susie. But before I tell you more, we're going to take a quick break. Marietta was in her home alone about a week after returning from Montana when the house phone rang. Her parents were in town from Arizona, and they had camped their travel trailer in the yard. Marietta and her parents developed a signal, the placement of a neon orange card in the window, which would indicate to her parents that the kidnapper was on the phone. With Bill being at work and the kids at school, Marietta was home alone and needed someone to contact the FBI. One afternoon, Marietta answered the phone and she accepted a collect call from a man identifying himself as Mr. Travis. Mr. Travis claimed to be with Susie in Salt Lake City, and of course he mentioned the misshapen fingernails to prove he was legit. Marietta instantly recognized the voice as David's.
What an idiot.
To confirm Susie was still alive, Mr. Travis said he was going to put her on the phone. A young girl's voice could be heard saying, quote, "He's a nice man, Mommy. I'm sitting on his lap right now." But that wasn't Susie's voice. Marietta just knew it wasn't. As the conversation progressed, Mr. Travis slipped up. He asked Marietta why she had taped the anniversary call. This detail was not released to the public, but David had learned about it at the meeting at his attorney's office.
Oh, busted.
Busted! Realizing his mistake, he screamed, "You'll never see your little girl again," and slammed down the phone. Meanwhile, Marietta's mother had seen the orange card in the window and contacted the FBI. They were able to trace the origin of the call to a motel in Salt Lake City, Utah. Had David possibly been able to slip past the FBI surveillance team, as they suspected he did on the night the Girl Scout was attacked? Could he have done it twice?
Stealthy bastard.
Right? The Jaegers and the FBI were terrified that David had found his next victim, and the FBI decided they had to arrest him. But when they got to the motel, he wasn't there. And when they went to arrest him at his home, he wasn't there. Earlier that night, after shutting off his lights, he had slipped out a back window, snuck through a field, and has made his way to his warehouse. A car belonging to one of his friends was stored there, and David used that to travel to Salt Lake City, all under the watchful eye of the FBI. But later that day, he came back to Three Forks, and he was immediately arrested. In his pocket was a motel receipt and also the Jaeger's phone number on a piece of paper.
What a dipshit.
He's so stupid. But he thought he, I guess, was smarter than everybody else. Surprisingly, after his arrest, David gave the officers permission to search his house because they didn't have a search warrant yet. And what they found was ghastly. It was awful.
What? I don't understand why people give permission when you know you have some shit in your house.
Oh, and he's got some shit.
Like, you don't think they're going to find it? You hid it so well?
No, he didn't. I think he knew his goose was cooked. Inside the house, shoved in the back of a dresser drawer, was a black hooded mask with 2 eye holes slit in it.
Oh, that's scary.
Investigators believe he wore this while kidnapping and probably torturing his victims. 2 tickets, one for an adult and one for a child, to Disneyland were in his room.
Stop it.
Yeah, they were. But it was the freezer of his refrigerator where the most disturbing evidence was found. It contained numerous packages of wrapped meat. One of the packages was labeled Deer Burger, and another one said SDS, which coincidentally were the initials of Sandra Smallegan.
No, Talia.
When they opened the first package, they found Sandra's right hand, her fingernails still polished. The other package contained some of the fingers of her left hand. The FBI later learned that only 2 weeks prior to the discovery, David had brought what was described as a meat casserole to the church picnic.
No.
They don't know for sure what was in it, but I had to put this in the story. A hand-drawn map of the Silver Cloud campsite where the Girl Scout was attacked was also found in his house. Investigators searched the warehouse owned by David. There they found sheets and a bedspread saturated with what was later determined to be human blood. Although investigators did a thorough search of David's warehouse, 31 years later, they would discover that they missed something. After his arrest, David was offered a deal in exchange for his confession. The county prosecutor would not recommend a sentence of death if he admitted guilt to all the crimes he'd committed in that county. David Meirhofer removed his mask of sanity and admitted to murdering 4 children in the past 7 years. He was in fact a serial killer before the term had even been developed. His first victim was a 13-year-old boy named Bernard Pullman, and that was in 1967. Bernard had been playing on the Nixon Bridge that crossed the Gallatin River with a friend when David drove by in his truck. David knew the boys, and for whatever reason, he decided to park his truck down the road, walk into the woods with his .22 caliber rifle, and shoot Bernard in the chest. His friend didn't even know what happened. All he knew is that Bernard fell into the water. He eventually died. It was a senseless crime, and David offered no motive for it at all. It was just random. Next, David admitted to the murder of 12-year-old Boy Scout Michael Rainey. He explained that he entered the Missouri River Headwater State Park on the evening of the crime with one intention: to kidnap a child, any child. He tried to choke Michael, and I think it might have been with a rope, but I'm not sure. He said he couldn't position it properly. Michael yelled for help, as you know, and in David's panic, he stabbed him in the back and ran away. Contrary to the autopsy report, David denied hitting Michael over the head. But he did. That's why Michael died. As you'll soon learn, David's confession is weaved with lies. The details David provides regarding the homicide of Sandra Smallegan don't fit up with the crime scene evidence. But make no mistake, David is the guilty party.
Oh yeah, her hand was in the freezer.
He just doesn't want to admit to a lot of things. According to David, at 2 a.m., he crept into the apartment of Sandra and he accosted her while she was sleeping. He choked her unconscious, and then he tied her hands and her ankles together. He then placed duct tape over her mouth and carried her to the trunk of his car. He went back into the apartment to retrieve some clothes and then drove to the Lockhart Ranch. Opening the trunk, David was surprised to discover that Sandra was dead. He claims the tape over her mouth must have prevented her from breathing, but obviously she has a nose. They didn't push the issue with him because they were afraid he would shut down on them, and they were desperate to find out what happened. David claims that while still on the ranch, he dismembered Sandra and burned her body in a fire pit along with some old wood shingles he'd found on the ground. The bloody sheets found in the warehouse contradict this version of events, and also the blood in the closet. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that the violent details of assault and rape were left out of his confession. Finally, David describes the assault and the murder of 7-year-old Susie. Similar to 4 years earlier, he went to the campground hoping just to abduct any child. He heard Susie and Heidi talking, and as you know, he kidnapped her and he drove her back to the Lockhart Ranch. There, he undressed her and, quote, proceeded to feel her body. And she got pretty wild, I guess, so I choked her and she died, end quote. However, the nail holes and the nails around the closet and around its trim paneling that were found in the ranch house led authorities to believe that Susie was held in that house for a prolonged period of time, raped, and then later murdered. I mean, they know someone was nailed shut in the closet of a dilapidated ranch house.
So sad.
Using a handsaw, he dismembered her body and he burned it, as he did with Sandra's. During his confession, David revealed that Susie's skull was thrown into the cesspit of the outhouse where the other bone had been earlier discovered. He said Susie's other remains were scattered along the countryside of Montana. Investigators did end up retrieving her skull in that cesspit. The FBI had a few more questions for David after he made his confession. Who was the little girl talking in the background during his conversation with Marietta? David clarified there was no little girl. It was just a recording he made of a movie and then played it. Now, who are the 2 tickets to Disneyland for? He didn't have any real response. The next morning, while eating his breakfast in a jail cell, an officer walked by David and asked him how it's going. His response was, quote, "Not so good." Fuck yeah, it's not going good. It's going real bad, David.
It's an understatement.
15 minutes later, he committed suicide using a towel to hang himself from his bunk bed.
I guess it was going real bad.
It was going real bad. Susie was buried in a private ceremony at a cemetery in Three Forks, Montana.
Oh, they buried her there?
They did. The Jaegers are such an amazing family. After the burial, they went and visited David's mother while she was working at an antique shop. They offered her their condolences for the loss of her son, and they told her that they forgave David. Both mothers sobbed and hugged before the Jaegers left Montana for the last time. Marietta went on to lecture against the death penalty. That was her way of coping with the tragedy. Bill, on the other hand, he kept to himself, and the two ended up divorcing. 31 years later, this case would get national news again. A builder who had purchased what I believe is the warehouse owned by David Meirhofer was doing some construction of it. And when he ripped down some of the boards, he found Sandra Smallegan's wallet, driver's license, and notebook. Apparently, David had boarded it up in the wall.
Wow. 31 years later?
Yeah. I wonder why I didn't do that with some of the other items, like the bloody sheets and things.
I know, that's just bizarre.
I got my information from a book written by Marietta Jaeger. It's called The Lost Child. I also read another book called Don't Kill Our Names by Rachel King, and another book by the FBI profiler Patrick Maloney. The book is called Matador of Murder. So that's where I got my information. And that's the story.
Wow.
I know, it's crazy. I'd never heard it before.
Me either, and considering they were from Farmington Hills.
I know, it's not far from where Tanya and I live.
No, you would think like the anniversary of it would be on the news or something like that.
I wasn't even born when it happened.
Well, I was.
You were just a little baby.
I was just a little baby.
This before true crime and you found each other.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that, Talia.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to this episode of Crimes and Consequences. If you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe/follow button. And if you like this episode and you want to help support us, because we don't make that much money, not really.
No,
we do it because we love true crime. The same reason you're listening. You can become a member and you don't have to listen to these commercials. God, commercials are annoying.
Commercials are annoying.
Not ours, though. Ours are lovely and you should listen to them. You can go to patreon.com/TNT Crimes, or you can go to our website, tntcrimes.com. I know a lot of people have asked about some of the missing episodes because they aren't in order anymore. Those episodes are free, but they're on our website, tntcrimes.com. And also, as I said, if you become a member, you get commercial-free episodes, you get live episodes, you get unreleased episodes to the public, and you get an award for being a super cool person.
You do.
You do. Super cool.
Super
cool. Anything else, Tanya?
You can find us on social media.
Oh, yeah.
On Facebook and Instagram at Hardcore True Crime.
Yes.
And that's everything.
Stay safe. Don't kill each other. And until next week.
Bye.
Bye.